A year before Judge Kenesaw Mountain Landis accepted the position as the first commissioner of baseball, he was nearly blown into 1,000 pieces. At the time, Landis was a federal judge for the Northern District of Illinois, presiding over some of the most high-profile cases in the nation. He was fiercely independent and made powerful enemies in the process. On May Day, 1919, 36 bombs were anonymously mailed to prominent figures across the country. When the story broke in Chicago, the press began speculating who in the city might be targeted. Judge Landis was at the top of the list. One reporter, half joking, said maybe he's already got one, and decided to check. According to biographer David Pietrusa, the reporter walked up to the judge's chambers and asked the secretary, "Did the judge get a bomb in the mail this morning?" The secretary didn't flinch. "The judge is liable to get anything," she said. "A batch of mail just came in." Still maybe thinking it a joke, the reporter began rifling through the stack until he stopped cold at a small, suspicious package. "It's a bomb," he shouted. The office froze, and the reporter set the package down and stepped back. When Judge Landis finally arrived, the people in the room warned him to be careful, to steer clear of the package. To this, Landis was furious. "It was sent to me in the mail," he told them, "so it is my property." Only after repeatedly pleading did Landis agree to let the police examine it at the station. Sure enough, the package contained a bomb. Moments later, standing at a safe distance, Landis watched as the device was carefully prodded and exploded. With an ashen face, the judge whispered, quote, "I would have opened it had I been in town when it first was received." End quote. This would not be the last bomb intended for the judge, and despite his clear recognition of the gravity of the situation, Landis would not change his behavior. For the next quarter century, Kenesaw Mountain Landis would rule baseball as some have called him, the first successful American dictator. One of my favorite introductions to Landis comes from writer Dan Busby of Sabre, who remarked, quote, "Some said that baseball owners found Judge Kenesaw Mountain Landis on the federal bench, but Leo DeRocher got it right when he said, 'They got him right out of Dickens.' Ruth put the fans back in the parks, but Landis made sure what they witnessed was honest. The Sultan and the Tsar worked different sides of the street, but between them, they saved the game." End quote. Tonight, the story of a man who stood 5 feet 6 inches tall, who weighed 130 pounds, but who emanated such bolster and conviction and righteous strength that the biggest, strongest, most powerful men in the world inevitably bent to his will. Kenesaw Mountain Landis, the squire, the czar, the dictator, the first and by far most influential commissioner of baseball, a man seen as righteous and honest, who also perpetrated one of the greatest deceptions and injustices in the history of the game. You're listening to the Midnight Library of Baseball, where there's no loud music, no jarring sounds, only nostalgic, thought-provoking, emotional stories about baseball. I'm Ben Orlando. One of the first questions that's probably on your mind is, where did Landis get his name, Kenesaw Mountain? David Pietrusa tells the origin story in his biography titled Judge and Jury, The Life and Times of Judge Kenesaw Mountain Landis. Surprisingly, this 2001 book is one of only 2 Landis biographies, and the first biography, written by Taylor Spinks in 1947, includes almost no information about Landis's life before becoming a commissioner. I don't understand why there are only 2, and really only 1 real biography of Landis. Pietrusa, who points out this truth in his book, also seems to be at a loss for why it took until 2001 to write the definitive book on the man. Because for nearly 50 years, half a century, Landis was larger than life. As big as, say, a mountain. Kenesaw's father, Abraham Landis, was a surgeon for the Union in the Civil War. And in 1864, Abraham found himself at the Battle of Kenesaw Mountain in Georgia, where Union casualties totaled more than 2,500 men. According to Kenesaw, quote, a 12-pound cannonball, apparently spent, was bounding toward the group. Nobody paid any attention to it, but it struck my father's left leg, just below the knee, and shattered it horribly. He had to keep his fellow surgeons off with a gun in order to keep them from amputating it. End quote. You'd think he would have done anything to shove this memory deep down inside, but apparently Abraham Landis had a morbid fascination with the geographical location of his most traumatic memory. After their 6th child and 4th boy was born, Abraham and his wife Mary argued for weeks over the name. And this is when Abraham got his chance. From David Pietrusa, quote, Mary Landis must have truly hated the name Abraham, not to mention all the other proposals, for when her husband finally suggested, let us call him Kenesaw Mountain, she agreed. End quote. It's a great story and icebreaker, right? Where did you get your name? Oh, it's inspired by the site where my father's leg was shattered by a Confederate cannonball. Where did you get your name? I got it from my uncle. Kenesaw's brothers were named Walter, Charles, John, and Fred. His 2 sisters, Sarah and Catherine. So even before he was born, Kenesaw was different. But like so many of the world's most innovative and controversial figures, Kenesaw Mountain Landis was seen as different. In his family, he was considered to have a lordly manner, which is why they nicknamed him the Squire, a nickname which followed him into the public realm. Also, like so many of the world's prominent outside-the-box figures, Landis was a high school dropout. Now, you might think, for the time, late 1800s, this is no big surprise. Many people did not graduate from high school. But Landis's family was well educated. His father was a doctor who believed in the university. His 4 brothers would go into either journalism or politics, or both. His sisters would take up the only occupations available to women at the time, teachers. But Kenesaw hated algebra so much that at the age of 15, he dropped out of high school. And he kept this secret from his father for 6 months. When Abraham Landis did find out, he was aghast. But as hard as he tried, he couldn't make his son return. So Landis held a series of odd jobs, and in 1889, he decided to become a lawyer. Now, what this meant in Indiana in 1889 was that Landis passed some simple tests and applications, and just like that, he was a member of the Indiana Bar. He didn't have to graduate from high school or attend law school. And maybe because he did none of these things, he was also not able to get any clients. So he went to law school and graduated in 1891. 14 years later, in 1905, he was nominated by Teddy Roosevelt and approved by the Senate as a federal judge in the Northern District of Illinois. This is the Midnight Library of Baseball, and Landis's role in baseball is why I'm telling this story. But there are stories from the past that influence who he becomes as a man and commissioner of baseball. And the stories that I find fascinating have to do with conceptions and misconceptions. For example, when you see pictures of Landis as the baseball commissioner, you see this stern, serious, but also crazed, maybe slightly insane older man with wild white hair and piercing eyes. Writer H.K. Middleton described him as having, quote, features finely chiseled, upon which rest almost continuously a threateningly serious express, end quote. You can see pictures of him on my Patreon account. He has an unforgettable look. And yet this hardened old man in his early 20s raced bicycles. But not the kind of bicycles you and I ride today. No, he raced those old-timey bicycles with the huge front wheels. It's funny to picture this stern, scowling Judge Landis atop one of these ridiculous-looking bicycles. But again, he didn't just ride them, he raced them. The more I read, the more I started to see the older Landis with the piercing gaze atop the bicycle. Because racing these large-wheeled bikes was not a simple act of fun. You had to be focused and determined. I mean, just take a second to imagine how hard it would be to simply mount one of these bikes and maintain your balance. Then think about the roads in the late 1800s. Most roads were unpaved and bumpy as hell. As for safety equipment, helmets, pads, well, there was none. And atop these unstable, extremely tall death traps, Landis tried to go as fast as he could. I can see him leaning over the handlebars, that same crazed look in his eyes. And not only did Kenesaw Mountain Landis race, he schemed. And I love this story from David Pietrusa, who writes, quote, Landis sought every advantage. Prior to one key competition in another town, he purchased 20 racing medals from a curio dealer and ostentatiously pinned them on his chest. The display cowed the local competition and helped give him an edge. End quote. I mean, who does that? It's the kind of move you see in a film. Landis peppered his chest with medals he hadn't won to intimidate the competition. But these are the kinds of details that give you insights into a man. Landis mapped out a plan in his head. He traveled to this curio shop. He spent money and time it took to fasten these medals to his chest. That's a lot of work to win a bicycle race. So what else is he willing to do when the stakes are higher? Again, what does this have to do with baseball? Well, how does a man get chosen to be the first commissioner of Major League Baseball? In 1920, baseball was huge in America. It was the sport. And you're talking about selecting someone to oversee this hugely important organization, this pastime that meant so much to so many people. You're selecting someone to make decisions that could lift or sink the ship. in a tumultuous time. So why, of all the prominent, influential, powerful, capable men in America, and I know I'm saying man, because at this time, of course, it would be a man, but of all these male choices, how did they choose Kenesaw Mountain Landis? The very fact that these men in baseball did choose him makes him immediately interesting. But one answer to this question came in 1907, when Landis, now a federal judge, sat for a case against Standard Oil, the biggest oil company in the world by far, still at the time run by John D. Rockefeller. And just like the bicycle example, the details of this case and Landis's role in it help us learn about what kind of man he was and how this would transfer to overseeing Major League Baseball. In 1907, Landis is 39 years old. He's a federal judge. He's 5'6", 130 pounds, and he's squaring off against the richest man in the world. If John D. Rockefeller were producing this podcast, he wouldn't need your support. He could buy this podcast, the podcast platform, and various countries to boot. And anyway, Rockefeller was more of a golf guy. No evidence he cared for baseball. So, boo Rockefeller. If you want to support Midnight Library of Baseball and stick it to the ghost of a greedy old oil tycoon, donate to the show at midnightlibraryofbaseball.com. You can also write a review on iTunes or Spotify. And check out my Patreon account. You can find a lot of free items like photos and articles linked to past episodes, and baseball book recommendations. With a paid membership, you gain access to full video interviews with past guests, and additional episodes not found through the normal feed. The latest Extra Innings episode covers the full story of banned White Sox third baseman Buck Weaver, who for nearly a century has been seen as more of a sympathetic figure than even Shoeless Joe. But new evidence unearthed in the last few years turns the tables on Weaver's supposed innocence. Check it out at patreon.com/Midnight Library of Baseball. Now, back to the show. When I say John D. Rockefeller was the richest man in the world, I mean by a lot. His net worth in 1907 was between $900 million and $1 billion. That was nearly 3 times more than the next closest man, Andrew Carnegie, at 300 to 400 million. Now, a straight inflation translation to today would give Rockefeller around $32 billion. But comparing his purchasing power and his wealth as a percentage of the wealth of the whole United States, according to Guinness World Records, Rockefeller's net worth today would top out at $638 billion, making him the richest person ever. John D. Rockefeller stood so far apart from everyone else, it was ridiculous. And in 1907, a 39-year-old judge from Illinois demanded that he show up in court. When, you might wonder, was the last time Rockefeller appeared in court? 1888. For nearly 20 years, he and his wealth machine wiggled out of any trial or hearing. And he was wiggling for sure now. His lawyers said it would be a hardship for the old man, he was 68, to make the journey. When Landis didn't concede, Rockefeller went underground. He disappeared. But Kenesaw Mountain Landis continued to press, continued to issue warnings and subpoenas, until finally this industrial megalith showed up in court. This was such a major event. It was such a big deal, Rockefeller showing up to court, that in addition to the federal building's normal security, Secret Service agents were brought in to control the crowd, along with Pinkerton Agency detectives, and 20 Chicago police called in to clear the path. Once inside, Rockefeller sitting on the witness stand, Landis on the bench, nothing much happened. There were no great questions that Landis wanted to ask. This whole affair was meant to show that no one was above the law. And in this case, no one was above Judge Kenesaw Mountain Landis. I'm not going to get into the reason for the court case, other than that Standard Oil was accused of engaging in illegal and unfair practices, which they'd been doing throughout their existence. In the end, the jury found Standard Oil guilty, and Judge Landis, whose job it was to set the penalty, set a steep one. From Pietrusa, quote, "He decided to hit Standard Oil, a defendant whose wealth had been matched only by its arrogance, with the maximum financial penalty, a $20,000 fine for each of the 1,462 counts, for a total of $29,240,000. It was the largest fine ever imposed by an American court." End quote. The Chicago Tribune equated the sum to 6 times the national budget of Venezuela and slightly more than half the money coined by the U.S. Mint that year. It was an outrageous fine, and it sent ripples throughout the country and the world. But the American people loved it. Not only did someone finally stand up to one of these monopolies, but they punched them right between the eyes. Newspapers praised Landis. Judges and lawyers and prominent figures celebrated his decision. At the same time, many people thought it was too much. And in fact, Standard Oil would appeal. There would be retrials. And in the end, Standard Oil never ended up paying a dime. Considering what happened later, some might say Standard Oil got the last laugh, because in 1952, 8 years after Landis's death, Continental Oil, a descendant of Standard Oil, purchased Landis's home in Logansport. They tore it down and put up a gas station in its place. But in 1907, Kenesaw Mountain Landis was on the map. As David Pietrusa writes in his book, for about a week, Landis may have been the most talked about human on the planet. Let's just pause to consider that. The most talked about human on the planet. How would you feel if you knew that, or let's say the next hour, you were the most talked about person on Earth? In America, in Canada, in France, and Egypt, and Laos, and Tibet, and Australia, people were talking about you, and most of them were saying very nice things. How would you feel? What would you do? What would your opinion be of yourself? For Kenesaw Mountain Landis, this was the case. For an entire week, and this impression would stay with people for years. People were urging him to run for office, to run for president. He was honest. He told you how it was, even if he knew you wouldn't like it. Even if he knew you might try to kill him. Over the succeeding years, Landis took on the meatpacking industry, murder trials. He took on the Chicago mob. And when America entered World War I, Landis took on dissenters. and he took on prohibition before turning his attention, finally, to baseball. One incentive for Landis's patriotism was his son, Reed. Landis loved his son above all other people and things. And when Reed entered the war as a fighter pilot, Landis was enormously proud, and he let people know. If his patriotism was high before this event, his son entering the war catapulted his national pride to the stratosphere. And here's another one of those many what-if situations with Kenesaw Mountain Landis, and for us. Because when Reed Landis became a fighter pilot, airplanes were rudimentary, not far from the biplane models of Orville and Wilbur Wright. Reed, first fighting with the British, then the U.S., was nearly killed on numerous occasions, to the point where, after the war, he said, quote, "The war's over and I'm alive. I haven't a right to be. I should have been killed a dozen times." End quote. If Reed had been killed, what would have happened to Kenesaw Mountain Landis? Would he have grown bitter? Would he have shriveled from the world, opening a space for another commissioner? We'll never know. What we do know is that by the end of the war, Reed Landis was the third best ace in the United States in terms of number of enemy planes shot down. So Kenesaw Landis's patriotism was strong. But it's helpful to understand the context. Patriotism was jacked up across the country. In 1918, Congress passed the Sedition Act, which forbade anyone to utter, print, write, or publish any disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the form of government of the United States. But Landis was at the front of the line. When Germany sunk the Lusitania, Landis tried to subpoena Wilhelm II, who either went by king or emperor. In order to get justice for the sinking, Landis thought Wilhelm II, his 6 sons, and 5,000 leading German militarists should be shot. And here's where Landis is interesting. When it came to German Americans or German victims, Landis had great sympathy. There was a case of a German who survived a torpedoed freighter and then wrote a nasty letter to the U.S. government about pay they owed him. This, of course, violated the Sedition Act, but Landis felt bad for the man. He not only dismissed the charges, but paid for the man's hospital visit and then got him the money he was owed. And just to highlight Landis's concern for the underdog, as a judge, he'd heard several cases over his career of bank employees who were caught robbing their banks. In some of these cases, Landis's wrath came out not on the bank robbers, but on the banks for not paying the employees a decent wage, which, in Landis's mind, led to them turning to crime. But much of the time, Landis had no tolerance for people who talked poorly of the U.S. government, or who tried to wiggle their way out of fighting in the war. From 1917 to 1919, Landis sentenced hundreds of conscientious objectors or protesters to prison, often slapping them with the maximum sentence, a year and a day in jail. The last thing Landis was known for before he turned to baseball was prohibition. And there happened to be a connection between patriotism and prohibition, in that most of the country's brewers were German or German American. So while there was a separate homegrown anti-alcohol movement, there was also this push to turn against Germany by turning against beer and alcohol. And Kenesaw Mountain Landis was on board, shutting down bars and speakeasies and handing out jail sentences and fines to anyone who got in his way. And of course, baseball was hugely affected by Prohibition. But that's a story for another night, or part 2 of this episode. But this is the context when the big wigs of baseball approached Landis in 1920. A war-racked nation recovering from devastating losses and trying to find comfort and solace in the things, like baseball, that were embedded in the fabric of the country. But you also had Prohibition and tens of thousands of people breaking the law. You had war dissenters in jail, and you had a major scandal in Major League Baseball with the 1919 World Series fix, and millions of fans wondering if they could ever trust the game again. Who could win back that trust? What person had proved himself to be trustworthy, to be above corruption, to go after the most powerful, elusive predators over and over again? What man withstood death threats and bomb scares to do what he believed was right? Kenesaw Mountain Landis. From Dan Busby, quote, "Not since Abraham Lincoln had a person in public life possessed features so memorably, so indisputably honest. A picture of rigid dignity." End quote. Next time, in episode 12, Major League Baseball comes calling. Kenesaw Mountain Landis accepts the job, and then all hell breaks loose. Before we end tonight, we have a listener baseball story. This comes from Janice in San Francisco, whose story will be read by Michelle May.
Dear Ben, and to those who love it like I do. Baseball is more than a game. It has always been my home, my sanctuary, my guiding force. It's the rhythm of my heartbeat, the pulse of my passion, the very fabric of who I am. I was the only one in my family who ever cared about sports. But baseball wasn't just a pastime to me. It was everything. It was strategy, it was art, it was logic, and yet, somehow, it was magic. It filled the gap that existed between my father's love of critical thinking and my yearning for connection. Where my father valued books and research, I saw baseball as a living, breathing manifestation of those lessons. Every game a layered chess match. Every play a study in probabilities, anticipation, and decision-making. I would sit, scorebook in hand, tracking statistics, understanding patterns, and visualizing what would come next. I joke that my passion is baseball, but my religion is the St. Louis Cardinals. I tried to get married at Busch Stadium, too, in 1991. And my husband and I laughed that our song isn't a love ballad. It's the legendary Jack Buck calling plays in his iconic cadence. As a woman, there was never a space for me in the game itself, so I worshipped it from afar, giving it every ounce of devotion I had. Then came Shoeless Joe by W.P. Kinsella. I devoured it. It was everything I never knew I needed. When Field of Dreams was released, I thought I had died and gone to heaven, pun intended. I knew I would love it, but my visceral reaction caught me off guard. It wasn't just about fathers and sons. It was about understanding, reconciliation, and bridging the gap between generations. It made me realize that my love of baseball had always been a way of showing my dad that I listened, that I valued the lessons he had instilled in me. It was the way I longed to have a catch with him, even if the catch was metaphorical. Then I found your podcast and the Field of Dreams series in season 2. I cried. I cried because finally I felt seen. I cried because someone else loved it as deeply and fiercely as I did. I cried because, for the first time, I felt a part of a community that understood the way baseball wasn't just a sport. It was a language, a connection, a love. And now, in a way that has come full circle, I share my father's passion for thinking and my lifelong love of baseball with my son. Baseball is memory. Baseball is family. Baseball is hope. And to those who love it like I do, to those who see it as more than just a game, you are my people. With all the love, devotion, and unwavering passion for the game, Janice.
Thank you so much, Janice, for such a beautiful letter. And thank you, Michelle. That's all for tonight. Next week, part 2, the Honorable Judge Kenesaw Mountain Landis comes to baseball. To many, he was the man who saved baseball. To others, he was a symbol of silence and exclusion that scarred the game for generations. Next time on the Midnight Library of Baseball. The show is produced and edited by me, Ben Orlando. Music by Sergi Patkin and Ashot Danielian at Pixabay. Good night.